Hello, 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 everyone, and welcome to another segment of Divine Femininity United. I am your girl, Dr. Bianca Miss B. Lee, and we are here with a new book, y'all. Yes, yes, yes. Today is day one of our new book. We just finished The Shack and The Shack Revisited, which was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. It was mind blowing. It was transformative. It was expanding. It was leveling up. It caused us to enhance our view of what we thought we knew of what it meant to be in relationship with God the Father, God the Mother, okay, Jesus, Sarah you, which was the Holy Spirit. We our eyes were opened to a better understanding more about relationship and not about religion in terms of the faith, okay? And I love that for us. I love that for us so very, very much. Today, you all, though, we are taking, because we've been on the readings of books that have been, really, really serious, really, really deep, and those things, and they're necessary. Don't get me wrong. They were necessary for sure. But we're going into a little more of a whimsical mode, okay? We're going to activate the inner child in us, which we need to do often. Okay, we need to do often. If you follow my any of my platforms, and if you visit my website, then you see that one of the focuses that we are focusing on now in the new year has been working on inner child healing, inner child traumas, releasing inner child pain, and all of those things, and reconnecting with that inner child. Every single one of us, all of us as adults. Yes, our bodies have aged. Yes, we've been here for years. Yes, we've experienced things, but in every single adult, there is a child. In every single adult, there is a child. Okay. And so we cannot neglect the child trying to be so grown all the time. Okay. Because being so grown will prevent you from accessing the creativity aspect of you, the fun, the laughter, the love, the zealousness, the openness, the heart, the just the play that we did as kids, the imagination, the fearlessness. Because you listen, kids aren't afraid of nothing, okay? They are super bold, super, imaginative. You cannot tell a child that the towel that they wrapped around their neck and tied in a knot is not a cape, and they did not turn into Superman. Okay, you cannot tell a child that that box that they are scooting around the floor in is not a car, a truck, whatever the case, a spaceship. You cannot tell a child that that broom that they hopping around in the house and galloping about is not a horse. That is the imagination that we need to maintain activation. We need to really, really keep it going, keep it fresh, keep it alive, keep it active. And that is what this today that we're going to be entering into. That's what this is going to do for us. Hopefully you receive it. Hopefully you have a good time. Hopefully your imagination can view everything that is entailed by this book, A Wrinkle in Time. There is a movie adaptation of this. Yes, there is, and it's so much fun. Oprah is one of the cast members, which is so cool. It's a very colorful, very imaginative, but it is quite enlightening. You have got to know that although whimsical, it's definitely got a message on it. You got to know that. If you allow yourself to be open, allow yourself to be a kid, allow yourself to go into the space of vision and imagery and things like that, then you will follow along just fine. Okay. All righty, you all. This begins A Wrinkle in Time. You all listen. As with every other book that we read, this one is available for you at any given time. I will tell you exactly how you can acquire your copy of this book. It's an ebook PDF version, okay? So you'll be able to pull it up wherever. You can pull up your Google or Google Drive and things like that, and you can just read whenever, read at lunch, read whenever, okay? All righty, honey. Without further ado, this is A Wrinkle in Time, written by Madeline Lingle. All right, we're going to begin with an appreciation. This is written by Anna Quindlen. The most memorable books from our childhoods are those that make us feel less alone, convince us that our own foibles and quirks are both as individual as a fingerprint and as universal as an open hand. That's why I still have a copy of A Wrinkle in Time that was given to me when I was 12 years old. It long ago lost its dust jacket. The fabric binding is loose and water stained, and the soft and loopy signature on its inside cover bears little resemblance on the way I sign my name today. The girl who first owned it has grown up and changed, but the book she loved, though battered, is still magical. Its heroine is someone who feels very much alive indeed. Meg Murry has braces, glasses, and flyaway hair. She can't seem to get anything right in school, where everyone thinks she is strange and stupid, and she runs up against some real nastiness at a young age in the form of all those snide looks and comments about her father, a scientist who seems to have mysteriously vanished, or town gossip has it, run off with another woman. But Meg doesn't know real evil until she sets out on a journey to find her father and bring him home, along with her little brother, Charles Wallace, and a boy named Calvin. As they transcend time, space, and the limitations of their own minds, they get help from individuals of great goodness. Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Witch, Mrs. Who, the Happy Medium, and Aunt Beast. But the climax of their journey is a showdown with it, the cold and calculating disembodied intelligence that has cast a black shadow over the universe in its quest to make everyone behave and believe the same. If that sounds like science fiction, it's because that's one way to describe the story. Or perhaps you call it the fiction of science. The action of the book, the search for Meg and Charles Wallace's missing father, relies on something called tesseract, which is a way to travel through time and space using a fifth dimension. Although there's even a little illustration to make it easier to visualize, I still am not certain I do. Of course, Meg, who is so bright she could do square roots in her head, doesn't entirely understand it either. For just a moment, I got it, she says. I can't possibly explain it now, but for a second, I saw it. The truth is, I'm not a fan of science fiction, and my math and physics genes has always been weak. But there's plenty in the book for those of us predisposed towards the humanities as well. Mrs. Who remedies her language deficit by using the words of others to explain herself, quotes Dante, Euripides, and Cervantes, to name just a few. When Meg is trying to keep it from invading her brain, she realizes the multiplication tables are too rote to do the trick and instead shouts out the opening of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. It retorts that that's the point. Everybody exactly alike. Meg replies triumphantly, no, like and equal are not the same thing at all. Madeleine L'Engle published Wrinkle in 1962 after it was rejected by dozens of publishers, and her description of the tyranny and conformity clearly reflects that time. The identical houses outside which identical children bounce balls and jump rope in mindless unison evoke the fear so many Americans had of communist regimes that enshrine the interests of state-mandated order over the rights of the individual. Why do you think we have wars at home? Charles Wallace asked his sister, channeling the mind of it. Why do you think people get confused and unhappy? Because they all live their own separate individual lives. He tells Meg what she already knows from her own everyday battles. Differences create problems. But while Lingle's story may have originally been inspired by the gray sameness of those communist countries, it still feels completely contemporary today, except maybe for Meg's desire for a typewriter to get around her dreadful penmanship. The Murry home is fractured by Mr. Murry's mysterious absence and Meg's mother sleeping alone in the great double bed. Calvin may look like a golden boy, but his family barely notices he's alive. Even more timeless is the sense Meg has of herself as a as someone who doesn't fit in. She does everything wrong, so to speak. Conformity knows no time or place. It is the struggle all of us face to be ourselves despite the overwhelming pressure to be like everyone else. Perhaps one of the most compelling and moving descriptions of that internal battle comes near the end of the book, when Mrs. Whatsit tells the children that life, with its rules, its obligations, and its freedoms, is like a sonnet. You're given the form, but you have to write the sonnet yourself. What you say is completely up to you. On its surface, this is a book about three children who fight an evil force threatening their planet. But it is really about a more primal battle all human beings face to respect, defend, and love themselves. When Meg pulls the ultimate weapon from her emotional arsenal to fight for her little brother and for the good, it is a great moment, not just for her, but for every reader who has ever felt overlooked, confused, alone. It has been more than 4 decades since I first read A Wrinkle in Time. If I could test her, perhaps in some different time and place, I would find a Meg Murry just my age, a grown woman with an astonishing brain, a good heart, and a unique perspective on how our differences are what makes life worth living. Oh, how I would like to meet her. That was good. That was the acknowledgments. Okay, so now we're getting into the book. Chapter 1, Mrs. Whatsit. It was a dark and stormy night. In her attic bedroom, Margaret Murry, wrapped in an old patchwork quilt, sat on the foot of her bed and watched the trees tossing in the frenzied lashing of the wind. Behind the trees, clouds scudded frantically across the sky. Every few moments, the moon ripped through them, creating raft-like shadows that raced along the ground. The house shook. Wrapped in her quilt, Meg shook. She wasn't usually afraid of weather. It's not just the weather, she thought. It's the weather on top of everything else, on top of me, on top of Meg Murry doing everything wrong. School, school was all wrong. She'd been dropped down to the lowest section in her grade. That morning, one of her teachers had said crossly, "Really, Meg? I don't understand how a child with parents as brilliant as yours are supposed to be, yours are supposed to be, can be such a poor student. If you don't manage to do a little better, you'll have to stay back next year." During lunch, she'd roughhoused a little to try to make herself feel better. And one of the girls said scornfully, "After all, Meg, we aren't grammar school kids anymore. Why do you always act like such a baby?" And on the way home from school, walking up the road with her arms full of books, one of the boys had said something about her dumb baby brother. At this, she'd thrown the books on the side of the road and tackled him with every ounce of strength she had, and arrived home with her blouse torn and a big bruise under her eye. Sandy and Denny's, her 10-year-old twin brothers, who got home from school an hour earlier than she did, were disgusted. "Let us do the fighting when it's necessary," they told her. A delinquent, that's what I am, she thought grimly. That's what they'll be saying next. Not mother, but them. Everybody else. I wish father. But it was still not possible to think about her father without the danger of tears. Only her mother could talk about him in a natural way, saying, "When your father gets back." Gets back from where? And when? Surely her mother must know what people were saying, must be aware of the smugly vicious gossip. Surely it must hurt her as it did Meg. But if it did, she gave no outward sign. Nothing ruffled the serenity of her expression. Why can't I hide it too? Meg thought. Why do I always have to show everything? The window rattled madly in the wind, and she pulled the quilt close about her. Curled up on one of her pillows, a gray fluffy of kitten yawned, showing its pink tongue, tucked its head under again, and went back to sleep. Everybody was asleep. Everybody except Meg. Even Charles Wallace, the dumb baby brother, who had an uncanny way of knowing when she was awake and unhappy, and who would come so many nights, tiptoeing up to the attic stairs to her. Even Charles Wallace was asleep. How could they sleep? All day on the radio, they had hurricane warnings. How could they leave her up in the attic in the rickety brass bed, knowing that the roof might be blown right off the house? And she tossed out with the wild night sky to land who knows where. Her shivering grew uncontrollable. You asked to have the attic bedroom, she told herself savagely. Mother let you have it because you're the oldest. It's a privilege, not a punishment. Not during a hurricane. It isn't a privilege, she said aloud. She tossed the quilt down to the floor of the bed and stood up. The kitten stretched luxuriously and looked up at her with huge, innocent eyes. Go back to sleep, she said. Just be glad you're a kitten and not a monster like me. She looked at herself in the wardrobe mirror and made a horrible face, bearing a mouthful of teeth covered with braces. Automatically, she pushed her glasses into position, ran her fingers through her mouse brown hair so that it stood wildly on end, and let out a sigh almost as noisy as the wind. The wide wooden floorboards were cold against her feet. Wind blew in the crevices about the window frame, in spite of the protection of the storm sash was supposed to offer. She could hear wind howling in the chimneys. From all the way downstairs, she could hear Fortinbras, the big black dog, starting to bark. He must be frightened too. What was he barking at? Fortinbras never barked without reason. Suddenly she remembered that when she had gone to the post office to pick up the mail, she heard about a tramp who was supposed to have stolen 12 sheets from Mrs. Buncombe, the constable's wife. They hadn't caught him, and maybe he was heading for the Murray's house right now, isolated a back road as it was, and this time maybe he'd be after more than sheets. Meg hadn't paid much attention to the talk about the tramp at time because the postmistress, with a sugary smile, had asked if she'd heard from her father lately. She left her little room and made her way through the shadows of the main attic, bumping against a ping pong table. Now I'll have a bruise on my hip on top of everything else, she thought. Next, she walked into her old doll's house, Charles Wallace's rocking horse, the twins' electric train. Why must everything happen to me? She demanded of a large teddy bear. At the foot of the attic stairs, she stood still and listened. Not a sound from Charles Wallace's room on the right. On the left, in her parents' room, not a rustle from her mother sleeping alone in the great double bed. She tiptoed down the hall and into the twins' room, pushing again at her glasses as though they could help her see better in the dark. Denny's was snoring. Sandy murmured something about baseball and subsided. The twins didn't have any problems. They weren't great students, but they weren't bad ones either. They were perfectly content with a succession of B's and an occasional A or C. They were strong and fast runners and good at games. And when cracks were made about anybody in the Murray family, they weren't made about Sandy and Denny's. She left the twins' room and went on downstairs, avoiding the creaking seventh step. Fortinbras had stopped barking. It wasn't the tramp this time then. Fort would go on barking if anybody was around. But suppose the tramp does come. Suppose he has a knife. Nobody lives near enough to hear it. If we scream and screamed and screamed, nobody cared anyway. I'll make myself some cocoa, she decided. That'll cheer me up. And if the roof blows off, at least I won't go off with it. In the kitchen, a light was already on, and Charles Wallace was sitting at the table drinking milk and eating bread and jam. He looked very small and vulnerable sitting there alone in the big old-fashioned kitchen, a blond little boy in faded blue Dr. Denton's, his feet swinging a good 6 inches above the floor. Hi, he said cheerfully. I've been waiting for you. From under the table where he was lying at Charles Wallace's feet, hoping for a crumb or two, Fortinbras raised his slender dark head in greeting to Meg, and his tail thumped against the floor. Fortinbras had arrived on their doorstep, a half-grown puppy, scrawny and abandoned, one winter night. He was, Meg's father had decided, part Llewellyn setter and part greyhound, and he had a slender, dark beauty that was all his own. Why didn't you come up to the attic? Meg asked her brother, speaking as though he were at least her own age. I've been scared stiff. Too windy up in that attic of yours, the little boy said. I knew you'd be down. I put some milk on the stove for you. It ought to be hot by now. How did Charles Wallace always know about her? How could he always tell? He never knew or seemed to care what Denny's or Sandy were thinking. It was his mother's mind and Meg's that he probed with frightening accuracy. Was it because people were a little afraid of him that they whispered about the Murray's youngest child, who was rumored to be not quite bright? I've heard that clever people often have subnormal children. Meg had once overheard the two boys seemed to be nice, regular children, but that unattractive girl and the baby boy certainly aren't all there. It was true that Charles Wallace seldom spoke when anybody was around, so that many people thought he'd never learned to talk. And it was true that he hadn't talked at all until he was almost 4. Meg would turn white with fury when people looked at him and clucked, shaking their heads sadly. Don't worry about Charles Wallace, Meg, her father had once told her. Meg remembered it very clearly because it was shortly before he went away. There's nothing the matter with his mind. He just does things in his own way and in his own time. I don't want him to grow up to be dumb like me, Meg had said. Oh, my darling, you're not dumb, her father answered. You're like Charles Wallace. Your development has to go at its own pace. It just doesn't happen to be the usual pace. How do you know? Meg had demanded. How do you know I'm not dumb? Isn't it just because you love me? I love you, but that's not what tells me. Mother and I've given you a number of tests, you know. Yes, that was true. Meg had realized that some of the games her parents played with her were tests of some kind, and that there had been more of her and Charles Wallace's than for the twins. IQ tests, you mean? Yes, some of them. Is my IQ okay? More than okay. What is it? That I'm not going to tell you, but it assures me that both you and Charles Wallace will be able to do pretty much whatever you like when you grow up to yourselves. Just wait till Charles Wallace starts to talk. You'll see. How right he had been about that. Though he himself had left before Charles Wallace began to speak, suddenly with none of the usual baby preliminaries, using entire sentences. How proud he would have been. You better check the milk, Charles Wallace said to Meg now, his diction clearer and cleaner than that of most 5-year-olds. You know you don't like it when it gets a skin on top. You put in more than twice enough milk. Meg peered into the saucepan. Charles Wallace nodded serenely. I thought Mother might like some. I might like what? A voice said, and there was their mother standing in the doorway. Cocoa, Charles Wallace said. Would you like a liverwurst and cream cheese sandwich? I'll be happy to make you one. That would be lovely, Mrs. Murry said, but I can make it myself if you're busy. No trouble at all. Charles Wallace slid down from his chair and trotted over to the refrigerator, his pajama feet paddling softly as a kitten's. How about you, Meg? He asked. Sandwich? Yes, please, she said, but not liverwurst. Do we have any tomatoes? Charles Wallace peered into the crisper. One. All right, if I use it on Meg, Mother. All right, if I use it on Meg, Mother? Okay. To what better use could it be put? Mrs. Murry smiled. But not so loud, please. That is unless you want the twins downstairs, too. Let's be exclusive, Charles Wallace said. That's my new word for the day. Impressive, isn't it? Prodigious, Mrs. Murry said. Meg, come, let me look at that bruise. Meg knelt at her mother's feet. The warmth and light of the kitchen had relaxed her so that her attic fears were gone. The cocoa seemed fragrantly in the saucepan. Geraniums bloomed in the window sills, and there was a bouquet of tiny yellow chrysanthemums in the center of the table. The curtains, red with a blue and green geometrical pattern, were drawn and seemed to reflect their cheerfulness through the room. The furnace purred like a great sleepy animal. The lights glowed with steady radiance. Outside, alone in the dark, The wind still battered against the house, but the angry power that had frightened Meg while she was alone in the attic was subdued by the familial comfort of the kitchen. Underneath Mrs. Murry's chair, Fortinbras let out a contented sigh. Mrs. Murray gently touched Meg's bruised cheek. Meg looked up at her mother, half in loving and a beauty as well. Half in loving admiration. Okay, I skipped the line. Half in sullen resentment. It was not an advantage to have a mother who was a scientist and a beauty as well. Mrs. Murray's flaming red hair, creamy skin, and violet eyes with long, dark lashes seemed even more spectacular in comparison with Meg's outrageous plainness. Meg's hair had been passable as long as she wore it tidily in braids. When she went into high school, it was cut, and now she and her mother struggled with putting it up. But one side would come out curly and the other straight, so that she looked even plainer than before. You don't know the meaning of moderation, do you, my darling? Mrs. Murray asked. A happy medium is something I wonder if you'll ever learn. That's a nasty bruise the Henderson boys gave you. By the way, shortly after you'd gone to bed, his mother called up to complain about how badly you'd hurt him. I told her that since he's a year older and at least 25 pounds heavier than you are, I thought I was the one who ought to be doing the complaining. But she seemed to think it was all your fault. I suppose that depends on how you look at it, Meg said. Usually, no matter what happens, people think it's my fault, even if I have nothing to do with it at all. But I'm sorry I tried to fight him. It's just been an awful week, and I'm full of bad feelings. Mrs. Murray stroked Meg's shaggy head. Do you know why? I hate being an oddball, Meg said. It's hard on Sandy and Denny's too. I don't know if they're really like everybody else or if they're just able to pretend they are. I try to pretend, but it isn't any help. You're much too straightforward to be able to pretend to be what you aren't, Mrs. Murray said. I'm sorry, Meglet. Maybe if father were here, he could help you. But I don't think I can do anything till you've managed to plow through some more time. Then things will be easier for you. But that isn't much help right now, is it? Maybe if you weren't so repulsive looking, maybe if I were pretty like you. Mother's not a bit pretty. She's beautiful, Charles Wallace announced, slicing liverwurst. Therefore, I bet she was awful at your age. How right you are, Mrs. Murray said. You just give yourself time, Meg. Lettuce on your sandwich, Mother? Charles Wallace asked. No thanks. He cut the sandwich into sections, put it on a plate, and set it in front of his mother. Yours will be along in just a minute, Meg. I think I'll talk to Mrs. Whatsit about you. Who's Mrs. Whatsit? Meg asked. I think I want to be exclusive about her for now, Charles Wallace said. Onion salt? Yes, please. What's Mrs. Whatsit stand for? Mrs. Murray asked. That's her name, Charles Wallace answered. You know the old shingled house back in the woods that the kids won't go near because they say it's haunted? That's where they live. They? Mrs. Whatsit and her two friends. I was out with Fortinbras a couple of days ago. You and the twins were at school. We liked to walk in the woods, and suddenly he took off after a squirrel, and I took off after him, and we ended up by the haunted house. So I met them by accident, as you might say. But no one lives there, Meg said. Mrs. Whatsit and her friends do. They're very enjoyable. Why didn't you tell me about it before? Mrs. Murray asked. And you know you're not supposed to go off our property without permission, Charles. I know, Charles said. That's one reason I didn't tell you. I just rushed off after Fortinbras without thinking. And then I decided, well, I better save them for an emergency anyhow. A fresh gust of wind took the house and shook it. And suddenly the rain began to lash against the windows. I don't think I like this wind, Meg said nervously. We'll lose some shingles off the roof. That's certain, Miss Murray said. But this house has stood for almost 200 years, and I think it will last a little longer. There's been many a high wind up on this hill. But this is a hurricane, Meg wailed. The radio kept saying it was a hurricane. It's October, Mrs. Murry told her. There's been storms in October before. As Charles Wallace gave Meg her sandwich, Fortinbras came out from under the table. He gave a long, low growl, and they could see the dark fur slowly rising on his back. Meg felt her own skin prickle. What's wrong? She asked anxiously. Fortinbras stared at the door that opened into Mrs. Murry's laboratory, which was in the old stone dairy right off the kitchen. Beyond the lab, a pantry led outdoors, though Mrs. Murry had done her best to train the family to come into the house through the garage door or the front door and not through the lab. But it was the lab door and not the garage door toward which Fortinbras was growling. You didn't leave any nasty smelling chemicals cooking over a Bunsen burner, did you, Mother? Charles Wallace asked. Mrs. Murry stood up. No, but I think I'd better go see what's upsetting Fort anyhow. It's the tramp. I'm sure it's the tramp, Meg said nervously. What tramp? Charles Wallace asked. They were saying at the post office this afternoon that a tramp stole all Mrs. Buncombe's sheets. We'd better sit on the pillowcases then, Mrs. Murry said lightly. I don't think even a tramp would be out on a night like this, Meg. But that's probably why he is out, Meg wailed, trying to find a place not to be out. In which case I'll offer him the barn till morning. Mrs. Murry went briskly to the door. I'll go with you, Meg's voice was shrilled. No, Meg, you stay with Charles and eat your sandwich. Eat? Meg explained as Mrs. Murry went out through the lab. How does she expect me to eat? Mother can take care of herself, Charles said. Physically, that is. But he sat in his father's chair at the table and his legs kicked at the rungs. And Charles Wallace, unlike most small children, had the ability to sit still. After a few moments that seemed like forever to Meg, Mrs. Murry came back in, holding the door open for, was it the tramp? It seemed small for Meg's idea of a tramp. The age or sex was impossible to tell, for it was completely bundled up in clothes. Several scarves of assorted colors were tied around the head, and that a man's felt hat perched atop. A shocking pink stole was knotted about a rough overcoat, and black rubber boots covered the feet. Mrs. Whatsit, Charles said suspiciously. What are you doing here? And at this time of night, too. Now, don't you be worried, my honey. A voice emerged from among turned up coat collars, stole scarves, and hat. A voice like an unoiled gate, but somehow not unpleasant. Mrs. Whatsit says she lost her way, Mrs. Murry said. Would you care for some hot cocoa, Mrs. Whatsit? Charmed, I'm sure, Mrs. Whatsit answered, taking off the hat and the stole. It isn't so much that I lost my way as that I got blown off course. And when I realized that I was at little Charles Wallace's house, I thought I'd just come in and rest a bit before proceeding on my way. How did you know this was Charles Wallace's house? Meg asked. By the smell. Mrs. Whatsit untied a blue and green paisley scarf, a red and yellow flowered print, a gold liberty print, a red and black bandana. Under all this, a sparse quantity of grayish hair was tied in a small but tidy knot on top of her head. Her eyes were bright, her nose a round, soft blob, her mouth puckered like an autumn apple. My, but it's lovely and warm in here, she said. Do sit down, Mrs. Murry indicated a chair. Would you like a sandwich, Mrs. Whatsit? I've had liver's-worth and cream cheese. Charles has had bread and jam, and Meg lettuce and tomato. Now let me see, Mrs. Whatsit pondered. I'm passionately fond of Russian caviar. You peaked, Charles cried indignantly. We're saving that for Mother's birthday, and you can't have any. Mrs. Whatsit gave a deep and pathetic sigh. No, Charles said. Now you mustn't give in to her, Mother, or I shall be very angry. How about tuna fish salad? All right, Mrs. Whatsit said meekly. I'll fix it, Meg offered, going to the pantry for a can of tuna fish. For crying out loud, she thought, This old woman comes barging in on us in the middle of the night, and mother takes it as though they weren't already anything particular about it at all. I'll bet she is the tramp. I'll bet she did steal those sheets. And she's certainly no one Charles Wallace ought to be friends with, especially when he won't even talk to normal, ordinary people. I've only been in the neighborhood a short time, Mrs. Watson was saying as Meg switched off the pantry light and came back into the kitchen with the tuna fish. And I didn't think I was going to like the neighbors at all until dear little Charles came over with his dog. Mrs. Watson, Charles Wallace demanded severely, why did you take Mrs. Bunkin's sheets? Well, I needed them, Charles dear. You must return them at once. But Charles dear, I can't. I've used them. It was very wrong of you, Charles Wallace scolded. If you needed sheets that badly, you should have asked me. Mrs. Watson shook her head and clucked. You can't spare any sheets. Mrs. Buncombe can. Meg cut up some celery and mixed it in with the tuna. After a moment of hesitation, she opened the refrigerator door and brought out a jar of little sweet pickles. Though why I'm doing it for her, I don't know, she thought as she cut them up. I don't trust her one bit. Tell your sister I'm all right, Mrs. Watson said to Charles. Tell her my intentions are good. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, Charles intoned. My, but isn't he cunning? Mrs. Watson beamed at him fondly. It's lucky he has someone to understand him. But I'm afraid he doesn't, Mrs. Murry said. None of us is quite up to Charles. But at least you aren't trying to squash him down. Mrs. Watson nodded her head vigorously. You're letting him be himself. Here's your sandwich, Meg said, bringing it to Mrs. Watson. Do you mind if I take off my boots before I eat? Mrs. Watson asked, picking up her sandwich, nevertheless. Listen, she moved her feet up and down in her boots, and they could hear water squelching. My toes are ever so damp. The trouble is that these boots are a mite too tight for me, and I never can take them off by myself. I'll help you, Charles offered. Not you, you're not strong enough. I'll help, Mrs. Murry squatted at Mrs. Watson's feet, yanking on one slick boot. When the boot came off, it came suddenly. Mrs. Murry sat down with a thump. Mrs. Watson went tumbling backward with the chair onto the floor, sandwich held high in one old claw. Water poured out of the boot and ran over the floor and the big braided rug. Oh, dearie me, Mrs. Watson said, lying on her back in the overturned chair, her feet in the air, one in the red and white striped sock, the other still booted. Mrs. Murry got to her feet. Are you all right, Mrs. Watson? If you have some liniment, I'll put it in on my dignity. Mrs. Watson said, still supine. I think it's sprained. A little oil of cloves mixed well with garlic is rather good, and she took a little bite of the sandwich. Do please get up, Charles said. I don't like to see you lying there that way. You're carrying things too far. Have you ever tried to get to your feet with a sprained dignity? But Mrs. Watson scrambled up right to the chair and then sat back down on the floor. The booted foot stuck out in front of her and took another bite. She moved with great agility for such an old woman. At least Meg was reasonably sure that she was an old woman, and a very old one at that. Mrs. Watson, her mouth full, ordered Mrs. Murry, now pull while I'm already down. Quite calmly, as though this old lady and her boots were nothing out of the ordinary, Miss Murry pulled until the second boot relinquished the foot. This foot was covered with a blue and gray argyle sock, and Mrs. Watson sat there, wrinkling her toes, contentedly finishing her sandwich before scrambling to her feet. Ah, she said, that's ever so much better, and took both boots and shook them out over the sink. My stomach is full and I'm warm inside and out, and it's time I went home. Don't you think you'd better stay till morning? Mrs. Murry asked. Oh, thank you, dearie, but there's so much to do. I just can't waste time sitting around frivoling. It's much too wild a night to travel in. Wild nights are my glory, Mrs. Watson said. I just got caught in a downdraft and blown off course. Well, at least till your socks are dry. Wet socks don't bother me. I just didn't like the water squishing around in my boots. Now, don't worry about me, Lamb. Lamb was not a word one would ordinarily think of calling Mrs. Murry. I shall just sit down for a moment and pop on my boots, and then I'll be on my way. Speaking of ways, shall wait, speaking of ways, pet, by the way, there is such a thing as a tesseract. Mm. Mrs. Murry went very white and with one hand reached backward and clutched at a chair for support, her voice trembling. What did you say? Mrs. Whatsit tugged at her second boot. I said, she grunted, shoving her foot down in, that there is, shove, such a thing, shove, as a tesseract. Her foot went down into the boot, and grabbling shawls, scarves, and hat, she hustled out the door. Mrs. Murry stayed very still, making no move to help the old lady. As the door opened, Fortinbras streaked in, panting, wet, and shiny as a seal. He looked at Mrs. Murry and whined. The door slammed. Mother, what's the matter? Meg cried. What did she say? What is it? The tesseract, Mrs. Murry whispered. What does she mean? How could she have known? Mm, well, Mrs. What said, okay now. Alrighty, so what I want to do here, that's fun. I love that. That was fun. And my inner child is happy about this whole thing. Okay, so in this first chapter here, we have Meg who is very, very, very down on herself. She is not speaking good positive things to herself. She almost like she dislikes herself. She resents who she is. She doesn't like her hair texture. She thinks she's ugly. Everybody in the town seems to think so too. She feels she's weird. She's not doing well in school. It's like she's believing all of the negative talk that's being told to her and the negative talk that she tells herself. It's like what she's heard, she's believed, and then she is beating herself with those beliefs. Mm-mm-mm. I need you all to follow this. I need you to follow it. Okay. Follow it. And then you have Charles Wallace, this little 5-year-old boy, 5 years old, who has this ability to discern. He has a potential to see. It's almost as if he knows what's about to happen before it happens. He being sat at the kitchen table already was expecting his sister to come down. Not only was he expecting her, he put enough milk in the pot, not just for her, but for his mother, who he also knew was going to be downstairs. He prepared it all because he saw. I'm going to like this book. I am going to like this book, man. And it is not by happenstance, you all, that these children, this child has these gifts. What's crazy about this whole thing, too, y'all, is that Charles Wallace didn't start to speak until 4 years old. He didn't say his first word until 4. Their father knew, based on the IQ test, oh yeah, he was going to be special. He superseded the IQ. So then problem is, Meg is believing the negative talk about herself. She's believing it. So she's not fully stepped into the demonstration, a full demonstration of her special gifts, her abilities, her power, because she's believing that she's not anything. She's believing that she's less than. She's believing that she's not special. She's believing the negative talk that was told to her. And then so much so, it's been happening so much so that she now turns that negative talk to herself, which has impeded on her special blossoming. See, Charles Wallace, he's not moved by that. He don't care about that. He knows who he is. He is fully himself. And it is something that Mrs. Whatsit actually identified. She says, it is awesome that you all allow him to be himself. You don't change him. You haven't tried to stop him. You let him be who he is. How many adults interfere with the child being who they are? Don't do that. Sit over here. Be quiet. Put that down. Go over here. What you doing all that laughing for? Sit down somewhere. All that dancing. Ain't no music. That's what it means to infringe on the child developing as themselves. Their father told them before he disappeared, in due time, your process is not everybody else's process. You will emerge and you will come into your abilities and your gifts in due time. Be patient and let them come naturally. How many adults are forcing their children to be and grow up sooner? They putting them on drugs. Hello. Getting them tested and can on. Quick to put a label on ADD, ADHD, autistic. Okay. All because they lack the patience to allow their child's development to happen in its own timing. I am going to thoroughly enjoy this book. Do you hear me? So that is the end of chapter 1. We read the introduction and we read chapter 1. Each week we're going to do a chapter, okay? Because I want your inner child to really kind of take the lessons take the nuggets. Don't just listen to it for entertainment. Yes, your inner child is enjoying it. Absolutely. If you just listen and allow yourself to envision, because the beauty about books, they're so detailed, okay? So they're going to give you the smells. They're going to give you the colors. They're going to give you the patterns, everything that's around, the details of the scene for you to envision. Allow yourself to envision. Allow yourself to be the kid, to be the child that imagines. Allow that, but also allow your consciousness as your full self to pick up the nuggets that's being detailed, okay? This is going to be beautiful. You all, to get your book, you got to email me. You have to email me, inbox me, for you to get your copy, your free PDF. It is free to you, okay? Yes, I am a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Yes, we do receive donations. However, donations are welcome. They are not required for you to get your copy of this book to follow along with us or to read at your own leisure. You can email me at info@biancamissblee.com. Again, info@biancamissblee.com. You can visit the website as well, biancamissblee.com. You can go there and you can see everything that we have going on the page. You can see the astrological transits. I'm about to post the Aquarius, the sun in Aquarius as of today. Shout out to Aquarians. Okay, we got some good. We've been in Aquarian energy actually since November. Actually, since last year, beginning of last year, to be honest. Pluto went into Aquarius, then it switched over to Capricorn and back into Aquarius, where it will remain well into 2030s, 2040. I'm telling you, okay. Listen, if you know, you know. If you don't understand what that means, go to my page. It's right there for you. Check out the astrological transits so that you can see how, not only what's going on, but how you can harness the energy of those transits, because they are happening for you. Okay? They're happening for you. All right? All righty. So listen, that is it for today. I enjoyed it. You all follow me on social media, okay? Follow me on all my platforms, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, now that it's back up and running. Hello, somebody. They had the world shooketh. So we are back on TikTok too. You can follow me there as well on all platforms, LinkedIn, Twitter, everywhere. Okay. Dr. Bianca Missblee Lee. All righty, you all, listen. That concludes today's segment. Know that I love you. Know that I mean it. Know that there is absolutely positively nothing you can do about it. And know that it won't matter. It won't even matter, whatever you try to do. Okay, you all have an amazing rest of your week. Let's get excited about this book, A Wrinkle in Time. Ooh, it's gonna be fun. It's gonna be fun. Those who listen on the replay, thank you for coming. Listen. Go back and replay it again so you can get a feel of what this is all about. Okay, so we can follow along. We'll be back here on Tuesday evening, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here at Divine Femininity United. You all have a great evening. Have a phenomenal, productive week. Peace.